Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora, ko Nicola Sullivan tēnei. Nau mai haere mai, and welcome to another Sigest episode. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the New Zealand Food Composition Database, which holds detailed nutritional information on more than 2,700 foods commonly consumed in Aotearoa. This week, we are joined by Plant and Food's Food and Health Information Team Leader, Dr. Carolyn Lister. Carolyn wants to provide people with science-backed information to help them make positive food choices. Carolyn will talk to us about the curation of the New Zealand Food Composition Database and her vast research into food nutrition. Ngā mihi, Carolyn.
Kia ora, Nicola. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Can you start by telling us about your interest in food science and how you came to study this research area?
I guess I've always had an interest in food, plants and science. When I was at high school, I entered local science fair, and one year I won a DSIR prize. And so I set myself a goal of working for the DSIR, the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. So I did a BSc degree at Canterbury University, and when I finished looking for jobs, I ended up in Wellington and making animal vaccines for a while. And then my dream job came up with the DSIR, and it was for a project looking at apple colour. So I took that job, ended up being offered to do a PhD on that. So at that point I was working on composition of apples and understanding what made up their colour. And then I had an opportunity to do a fellowship overseas, and I went and worked on the health benefits of red wine. So that's where I really switched from just looking at the composition of plants to understanding their health benefits. And then my career's evolved over time to really focus on that human health side and understanding the composition of the foods that we eat.
Awesome. That's a really varied way in, and fun to look at the health benefits of red wine, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Any taste testing you get to do?
Oh, we only needed a few mils for our analysis, so there was plenty of sampling as well.
Nice. That's very good. And of course, the DSIR was the predecessor to the Crown Research Institutes, right? And plant and food research eventually.
Yes, so I've gone through DSIR, then crop and food research, and now plant and food research. So change of organisational names, but really still doing the same sort of work.
Yeah, awesome. So what is the New Zealand Food Composition Database, and why is it important to have one?
So the database is a resource of a whole range of the components that are present in the foods that we eat in New Zealand. And it's really important because it helps us understand what we're eating and can be used to understand how the food changes, how it can be used to produce food labels for food manufacturers to develop new foods. But it can also help us understand, are we as New Zealanders deficient in certain nutrients, either because of the soils we have there or just because of our food choices. So it's a critically important resource for a whole range of different purposes.
It sounds awesome. It's something I'm really interested in. I'm quite interested in what's in the food that I eat. And I see, if you can pull up the database for me and we can have a bit of a look, because I actually haven't heard of this database before.
And it's amazing how many people haven't. And a number of years ago, all we had was this huge unwieldy spreadsheet of data and some printed tables that had very limited data in them. So what we did about 5-6 years ago now was to develop an online search, so we can search the database, and we can search it in all sorts of different ways. So take, for example, we can search for a food. So if we can look up a kiwi fruit, for example, and we can see on there's different types of kiwi fruit, because now we used to just have the green, but in recent years we've added the gold, and we're getting the red available on the market, so we can find that.
So you've got a list here of kiwi fruit, and you can click on any of them and start comparing
and start looking up, well, what's in that kiwi fruit. So we can pull up green kiwi fruit, for example. And the first thing we see when we go into the database is the information pretty much as you'd see it on a nutrition information panel on a food label. So we see things like the energy, the protein, the fat, the carbohydrates, dietary fibre, sodium. And we can see it on a 100-gram basis, which is sort of often used to compare foods, but we can also do it on a serving size. And we also have the ability to see all sorts of detail in the information. So you can go on there and select to see the potential nutrient claims. So this helps us see what nutrients are particularly important in different foods. So with the kiwi fruit, you'll see that there's quite a range of different nutrients there that are what we call claimable. So there's enough of that nutrient in there to have a benefit on human health. So you'll see green kiwi fruit's high in fibre, it's got some omega-3 fatty acids, folate, potassium, vitamin B6, C, E and K, so lots of different nutrients. And then for those who are really interested, we can go and get a lot more detail about the composition of that food. So we can select to see the whole data set. And in some cases, that can be up to nearly 300 different components. So depending on what your needs are and what you're looking for, you can select these different data sets to see the amount of data that you can manage to process.
Yeah,
so researchers are interested in all the detail, but most people just want to see the sort of nutrition information panel or the claims.
Yeah, so that's awesome, isn't it? Like there's lots of different layers to this that can be used by different users. So prior to you setting up the online database 5 or 6 years ago, was this information open to everyone?
It was open to everyone, but it was mainly people who had more technical knowledge, who were using it for research or for diet studies, who tended to use it. There was some use, we did do up sort of printed tables, but they only had, to make it a manageable size, it only had some of the foods and some of the nutrients. The other good thing is you can also search for a nutrient in the database. So if you've been told by your doctor or think you're low in iron, you can go and search for foods that are a good source of iron. So you can search for a particular nutrient, we can enter iron and pull up a list of foods that are high in iron. And likewise, if you're told to avoid, maybe you're on a diet and need to reduce your sodium, you can look for foods that are lower in sodium. So it can be used in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, that's great. And just looking at it now, it looks very user-friendly. I can see on the homepage, you've got right at the top, you can search for a food, you can search for a nutrient, you can do a multi-food search, or you can do a multi-nutrient search, and that's very clear. And then entering whatever you want to enter, it looks really usable and really helpful.
That was our intention, because people often struggle with understanding nutrient information and what it all means, and particularly in the context of the diet and what they're eating. A lot of tables just tend to put values per 100 grams, but that's not always meaningful, because sometimes you're having a drink, you're having 250 mils of something, but if you're putting Marmite on toast, you're only putting 5 grams of Marmite, so a value per 100 grams might look horrendous. And so it's all about being able to look at it on a per serve basis and relate it to your reference intakes of nutrients to know whether they're significant in terms of the diet.
And the serving size can often be hard to judge as just a general consumer of a product, can't it? And you think, how much is 100 grams? I don't know. How much am I eating?
Yeah, so what we do is we put a starting reference point and equate it to something. So if it's a glass of a drink, a glass equals 250 mils. Or if you're eating an apple, a typical apple might be 130 grams. And so we use that as the starting point for a serve, but there's the ability to adjust the serving size. So if you've only eaten half an apple, or if you're having kiwi fruit, and if you've eaten 2 kiwi fruit instead of 1, you can adjust the serving size and it automatically recalculates all the nutrient content to your serving size that you've eaten that particular time.
So it's great for individual consumers. And is that the main users of the database?
Uses of the database are so diverse, and that makes it challenging. The food industry uses it both for generating food labels, because sometimes they don't have to analyse their own product. If there's something directly comparable on the database, they can use that for a food label. We see that quite a lot, particularly with the fruit and vegetable industry. And it can be used also by the food industry if they're wanting to formulate a new product. So they might be wanting to develop a product that's high in vitamin A, C and E, so they can search, find good ingredients to use in their products. It's used by dietitians and nutritionists, so when they're talking to their clients, they can explain, nutrition information composition. It's used for when we do national nutrition surveys, so this is where there are interviews with people from around the country to look at what are they eating in a day and then calculating the nutrient content. Lots of researchers use it. It also gets used by quite a lot of students, so particularly university students who are doing nutrition dietetics, and they use it for specific student projects. But we've also done work with the likes of 5+ a Day and developed a resource around food composition for high school students, so they can go and use the database and do inquiry-based learning to understand about composition of food.
An amazing range of users and uses. And so much information in here. And you said, for example, that food producers might use this to put on their labels instead of having to analyse the food themselves. How much work goes into analysing a food to get all this detailed information?
It's actually quite a process, and it depends a little bit what the food is. So we want the data to be representative of the food supply across the country. So what will happen is we'll have people go and do shopping in different parts of the country, and then we'll collect these samples together, and then we have to produce what we call a composite. So say we're taking apples, we'll prepare them as if you're eating them. So we'll take out the core. In some cases we'll analyse them peeled and unpeeled, and then we blitz them up to get this homogenised mix, and we snap freeze that so we don't lose the nutrients. And those samples will then go off to a whole range of different labs for all the different analyses. So we're analysing the protein, the fat, the fibre, the sugars, range of different vitamins, minerals, and so there's lots of analysis and lots of different labs going on, and then we get that data back, and then we have to go and check that the data's sensible. There's no abnormalities in that data. And then in some cases we use that data to do calculations. So when we're looking at energy, for example, there are certain components in our food that contribute to the energy. So that takes into account the protein, the fat and sugar. So we have the software that calculates some of those additional components. And then again, another sense check of the data and various checks we go through before we can actually publish it. So it's quite a process from work that happens in the lab to work that happens in the computer and the software that manages all the data.
Absolutely. And this database you were saying has been going on for a long time. How much of the information needs updating? How regularly does it need updating, or does the nutrition stay the same in an apple, for example, for decades?
Again, it's a sort of mix of things. Some foods don't really change over time. If you're talking about sugar, white sugar, that's not going to change much. But other foods like apples, for example, the varieties change over time. The composition of the food's impacted by all sorts of other things, whether where they're grown. So we do have to regularly do updates of the composition of some foods. Other things happen, so fortification of bread, for example, with folate, so that will change the composition. So what we have to do is go through looking at the foods in the database and making a decision each year whether foods need updating, they're still okay. And we have a process where we select 70 to 100 new foods to do the analysis on each year. So we've got this continuous rolling update of the data.
So there's continuous rolling updates, a lot of curation and maintenance work, and a lot of end users. So how is the database funded?
So the database is funded by the Ministry of Health, and then sometimes we have additional data that's added. For example, Zespri want good composition on their own branded products, so sometimes they'll pay us to do analysis and then give permission to be published in the database. But the work that's funded by the Ministry of Health is automatically made publicly available. That's a condition of the work. So there, of course, they're driven by being able to improve the health of New Zealanders, and also the data helps inform policy.
Yeah, and I should say for listeners, you could either Google the New Zealand Food Composition Database, or it's www.foodcomposition.co.nz. And I'm keen to just go and have a play around and see what information I can get.
Yeah, and you can go delving into all sorts of things, and it's interesting to do things like the multi-food search, so you can compare a raw and a cooked vegetable, or look at a baked potato versus potato crisps and see what the difference in the nutritional composition is. So there's lots of ways you can go and explore the data. And those questions that come up at dinner parties, you can go and check whether people really have the right information.
Yeah, that's right, because there's a lot out there, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation about food. So if someone's saying, oh, this is a good source of something, you can go and check whether they're really right.
Yeah, that's awesome. So moving on from that, what should we look for in healthy food choices?
And that's a difficult one sometimes, because we all have our own needs. And it's important to have a balance, and it's looking at, are you having enough protein? You need some fat in your diet, but it's looking at those other components, at the vitamins and minerals, to make sure that you're having foods that are a source and a good source of the whole range of nutrients that we need. And that's the key thing. It's about having diversity, both in the different types of food we eat and what nutrients they provide for us.
And do you have a view on whether it's better to get your nutrients from, and your vitamins and minerals from food, or whether it's a good idea to take a multivitamin and get your vitamins and minerals that way?
I mean, most people should be able to get the vitamins and minerals they need through food, unless they have a particular condition that impacts their health. But it's a tricky one, because sometimes people are so busy that they're rushing around, and sometimes there are certain nutrients. So, for example, selenium, where soils are deficient in New Zealand in selenium. So sometimes there's a need for supplements, but again, it's looking, if you think, oh, you are deficient in something, is there a good food source of that? So selenium, if you go and look up, Brazil nuts are high in selenium. So just adding a couple of Brazil nuts in your diet, you can sort of help balance out and reduce the need for supplements.
And what about the debate on ultra-processed foods and, should we just eat raw foods?
Again, it's a balancing game. It's interesting because it's a huge debate at the moment on what constitutes an ultra-processed food. One of the issues is that it's often that the ultra-processed foods have high salt, high sugar, high fat. It's not always the case, but there is also the need to have not just raw foods, because processing, and when we're talking about processing, it can be something as simple as cooking. It can help release certain nutrients from the food, and the addition of some things like fat can help us absorb certain nutrients. So, for example, we have vitamin A and E that are fat-soluble vitamins, so we need some fat in our diet to absorb them. And there's studies that have been shown, particularly when there was the real anti-fat movement and there was fat-free salad dressings, you actually not absorbing all the nutrients from the salad because there was no fat there to help uptake of nutrients. And in some cases, cooking can have other benefits. So it's a mix of eating some stuff raw, because vitamin C is for example, is lost in cooking and, balancing that raw and cooked foods. And a bit of processing isn't a bad thing, but it's looking at what else is there in some of those ultra-processed foods.
In the database, you can see a raw carrot compared to a cooked carrot, can't you? And compare the...
Yes, at the moment, just on a straight nutrient basis, it doesn't give that sort of bioavailability information, and that's something that we'd like to add in the future. But yeah, you can compare foods to see whether nutrients have gone up and down.
And you touched on the anti-fat movement. For a long time we were told fat is bad, don't have fat. Now perhaps there's more of an anti-sugar movement. Is that fair?
Again, it's down to the amount. So we do need some sugars in our diet because that gives us energy, it's important for brain, but it's about the amounts. You don't want too much, and you're better looking at the overall diet and what you're eating. And some people go to the extent of cutting out fruit because it's got naturally occurring sugars in it, but then you're missing out on key nutrients and other health benefits that fruit delivers. It's also looking at in context of a diet, because if you have a fruit juice, for example, that's quite high in sugar, the sugar will be absorbed more quickly, whereas if you're having sugar in a food that's got fibre and structure there and other components, they'll modify the uptake of that sugar. So not all sugar's equal, and it depends on how you're having it and the amount you're having.
Always more complex than you first think.
That's the problem with dietary advice. Sometimes it's taken too, it's given very simply to help people understand, but it's actually far more complex than that. And that's one of our challenges, is how do you then communicate that to get the right information out to people.
What about serving sizes? Is that something that we should really be paying attention to?
Yes, and it's one that often confuses people. And for example, people sometimes in the vegetables think, I've got to eat so much. But a standard serving size for a vegetable is about 75 grams. And so it's a handful. So it's not as overwhelming as some people think. The other one that often goes the other way is people have too much meat and, again, don't have the serving size that's probably actually what's needed to deliver the nutrients. So, again, a piece of meat only often needs to be the size of your palm. So people go different ways depending on what the food is. But, again, it comes back to looking at what delivers sort of a good nutritional profile.
Is nutritional content different depending on where a food is grown? And is New Zealand food better for us if it's grown in New Zealand than overseas?
It can really vary, and there's a whole range of things that influence the final nutritional composition of a food. It can be where it's grown in the country and different climates, different soil types, whether it's grown through traditional growing practices or organic or regenerative, and it often comes down to particular crops too. New Zealand can sometimes have some specific advantages because of our growing conditions help to concentrate the nutrients in our food. Our soils are often better and are not as depleted, but it can vary. And for example, we've done some recent work looking at they're starting to grow peanuts in Northland. So it was like, they're not normally grown here. Are they going to have the same nutritional content? And we actually found they were higher. Sometimes because our growing conditions, they need to be grown for a bit longer, they've actually got more time to take up nutrients from the soil and accumulate nutrients. But again, there's no hard and fast rules. When it comes to some of our processed foods, we do have some advantages because with some producers, they've focused on looking at, good nutritional content, bit of fortification where it's needed. So it's about looking at it, what we need as New Zealanders.
We've talked a lot about how we can use the database as an individual, and you've mentioned that it's used by a huge range of end users. How can we use the database, or how is the database used to look at population level of nutrition in New Zealand, for example? Are we fairly high in our nutritional uptake?
One of the challenges that we have is that there hasn't actually been a national nutrition survey done since 2008, 2009. And so we don't have a really comprehensive set of data to know what we're like as a population in terms of our nutrient intake. And if you think, since that time, our food supply has changed a lot, and what we're eating, and particularly in some groups of the population, because that's the other thing, can't always just generalise. And in past surveys, it's found that, for example, teenage girls are missing certain nutrients in their diet, like iron. So what happens there is it's a very comprehensive survey looking at all different groups of the population. They're completing a questionnaire to provide data on the different foods they eat in a day and the amounts, and then the data is taken from the food composition to then translate what that toast in the morning, an apple, a sandwich, spaghetti bolognese for dinner, add up all those different foods to look at what the nutrient intake in a day is, and then build that up at groups of the population to look at what different nutrients are deficient or there's an oversupply of in the population. So that's a really important tool for helping then education, but also then guiding, are there things that need to be done with fortification of certain foods. So it's a really important data that needs to be gathered on a regular basis to understand how we can improve population health, not just at an individual level.
Are there any plans to do another national survey?
There's a little bit of work being started, but at the moment there's not the funding been set aside yet, and it's something we really strongly support the need for.
Do you have a vision for the future of what you'd like the New Zealand food composition database to look like?
Naturally, we just want to keep it growing, adding more foods. We're conscious with some of the changes, for example, with the shift to more plant-based foods, that we add these new foods into the database. And it's a bit of a challenge at the moment because it's hard to know what percentage of the population are eating them. And there's also a lot of change of products on the supermarket shelf, so you don't want to be analysing something that then has gone off the shelf next week. The other thing is there's a big focus at the moment around sustainability, so being able to help people make food choices that don't just deliver nutrients, but are good in terms of sustainability metrics and are good for the planet. At the moment, the database calculates the recommended dietary intake, so determining whether it's a food source or a good source of different nutrients off the label information. But we know that different groups of the population have different needs. So a teenage boy versus a pregnant woman, a 70-plus-year-old man have quite different nutritional needs. So we'd love to be able to build that into the database so people can put their profile in and it calculates that recommended dietary intake data at a personal level.
Yeah, that would provide really detailed, interesting information.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways we could add to the database. The other thing, at the moment, the focus is on the nutrients, but we also have a whole lot of work going on in all these sort of phytochemicals and other components in foods that are less well known but contribute to health. So to add some of that extra data in over time. But we don't fully understand how much we need of some of them at the moment. So that's why that data's not there, because it could be misleading at the moment in terms of how much you actually need of some of these things.
It must be really important to have all this detailed information to know that it's correct. And
yes, that's really key. And I mean, we want a database that's supported by robust science information because, as we were saying earlier, some of the information out there is really random. So sometimes you go and search for composition of things and you get data off Google that you think, that doesn't seem quite right. And so it's a really robust data set that we have. We don't just add any old data.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, for this fascinating discussion on food composition. It's a topic that's relevant to everyone. Thanks for introducing us to the New Zealand Food Composition Database so that we can potentially use it to inform how we make healthy food choices. And to our listeners, thanks for listening to another SciGest podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and rate our podcast to let us know how we're doing. You can also email any questions or suggestions to scigest@plantandfood.co.nz. Until next time, thanks for listening. Mā te wā.